The year is 1200. Across the vast expanse of West Africa, a dramatic transformation is unfolding. The once mighty kingdom that had dominated the region for over 4 centuries is crumbling. In its wake, ambitious powers are rising, commercial routes are shifting, and new forces are emerging from the shadows of history. This is the story of how one small kingdom called Kangaba would rise from this chaos to become the greatest empire medieval Africa had ever seen. The foundation of West African strength lay in a simple yet profound economic relationship: salt and precious metal. Between the Sahara Desert to the north and the tropical forests to the south stretched the Sahel, a vast corridor of grassland that served as the natural highway for African commerce. In the scorching mines of Tagaza, deep in the Sahara, workers extracted slabs of salt that were worth their weight in treasure to the farming communities of the south. Meanwhile, in the rivers and hills of Bambouk and Beret, skilled miners extracted the yellow metal that northern merchants desperately needed. Neither could survive without the other. The Sahara produced no precious metal. The forest regions produced no salt. Nature had created the conditions for one of history's most lucrative commercial relationships, and control over this exchange would determine which kingdoms rose to greatness and which faded into obscurity. Long before Mali existed, another power had mastered the art of controlling this commerce. The state known to outsiders as Ghana, called Ouagadougou by its own people, had emerged around the 6th century in what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali. For over 4 centuries, this kingdom had been the undisputed master of West African markets. Ouagadougou's genius lay not in producing salt or treasure, but in controlling the exchange between those who did. The kingdom positioned itself as the middleman in the most profitable commercial relationship in medieval Africa. Every caravan that crossed its territory paid taxes. Every merchant who conducted business in its markets paid fees. Every gram of precious metal that changed hands contributed to the royal treasury. The capital city of Kumbi-Salai was a testament to this wealth. Arab chroniclers described it as 2 cities in one: a Muslim commercial quarter where foreign merchants lived and conducted business, and a traditional African quarter where the king held court. The royal city was surrounded by a great wall and filled with magnificent buildings. The king himself lived in a palace complex guarded by 1,000 soldiers, and when he held court, he was attended by horses draped in cloth of gold and dogs wearing collars of silver. But this kingdom's power rested on far more than just taxation. Ouagadougou had developed sophisticated systems of administration that would later influence every successor state. Provincial governors, known as farba, collected tribute from subject territories across vast distances. A complex bureaucracy managed relations with North African states, maintaining diplomatic connections that stretched from Morocco to Egypt. These relationships provided merchants with protection when they traveled north and gave the government access to Mediterranean markets. The tribute system was particularly ingenious. Rather than demanding fixed amounts from each province, administrators adjusted payments based on local conditions and economic circumstances. During drought years, agricultural regions paid less. When routes shifted due to political instability, commercial centers received temporary tax relief. This flexibility prevented rebellions while ensuring steady revenue, creating a system that adapted to changing circumstances rather than breaking under pressure. Military organization reflected the state's commercial priorities. The army was built around mobility and communication rather than massive set-piece battles. Fast-moving cavalry units could quickly respond to threats against commercial routes, while infantry forces provided security for caravans and maintained order in market towns. A network of fortified positions protected key passages and stored military supplies, creating a defensive system that could project power across vast territories. The taxation systems became increasingly sophisticated over centuries of refinement. Different types of goods were taxed at different rates, encouraging business in high-value items like precious metals and ivory, while discouraging bulk goods that might clog routes. Foreign merchants paid higher rates than local dealers, but received guaranteed protection and access to markets. Special taxes on luxury items helped fund the royal court and military, while basic necessities remained lightly taxed to avoid burdening the general population.
Currency systems reflected the kingdom's role as a commercial intermediary. Precious metal dust was weighed using standardized measures, while salt bars served as currency for smaller transactions. Cowrie shells from the Indian Ocean, brought by Arab merchants, became a medium of exchange for everyday purchases. This monetary diversity allowed Ouagadougou to facilitate business between regions that used different currency systems, adding another layer of profit to commercial operations. The diplomatic network was equally impressive. Marriage alliances with neighboring kingdoms secured borders and routes while creating kinship ties that lasted for generations. Treaties with North African states protected merchants in foreign markets and established mutual defense agreements. The empire's reputation for wealth and stability attracted dealers from across the known world, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere in major commercial centers. The government also invested heavily in infrastructure that supported long-distance commerce. Wells were dug along caravan routes to ensure reliable water supplies. Rest houses provided secure accommodation for traveling merchants. Market towns were carefully planned with separate quarters for different types of dealers, reducing conflict and facilitating business. Road maintenance ensured that caravans could move efficiently even during the rainy season. But these sophisticated systems couldn't protect Ouagadougou from the challenges that emerged in the 11th century. The first threat came from an unexpected source: religious zealots from Morocco known as the Almoravids. The Almoravid movement began among Berber tribes of the Western Sahara as a religious reform movement aimed at purifying Islamic practice. But religious fervor quickly transformed into military conquest. The Almoravids built a disciplined army and began expanding both north into Morocco and south into West Africa, claiming divine mandate for their conquests. In 1076, Almoravid forces captured Kumbisala, the capital. The conquest was devastating, but not in the way most people imagine. The Almoravids didn't simply destroy the kingdom through military might. Instead, they disrupted the delicate balance of tolerance and cooperation that had made the commercial empire possible. The state had succeeded partly because it accommodated different religious and cultural traditions. The royal court maintained traditional African religious practices while welcoming Muslim merchants and scholars. Local rulers could continue traditional customs as long as they paid tribute and maintained order. This flexibility allowed Ouagadougou to serve as a bridge between the Islamic world of North Africa and the traditional societies of West Africa. The Almoravid conquest upset this careful balance. While not entirely destroying the political structure, the new rulers introduced religious tensions that hadn't existed before. Some local governors converted to Islam to maintain favor with the Almoravids. Others resisted, creating divisions within the territory. The unified system of regulation and taxation began to fragment as different regions responded differently to foreign rule. Environmental pressures compounded the political problems. The Sahel was experiencing one of its periodic drought cycles, and the effects were catastrophic. Rainfall declined significantly in the 11th and 12th centuries, devastating agriculture and forcing massive population movements. As crops failed and pastures dried up, conflicts erupted between farming and herding communities. Competition for water sources became fierce, while commercial routes shifted as merchants sought more stable regions. The economic surplus that had supported the complex political structure began to disappear. Tax revenues declined as business volumes dropped. Provincial governors found it increasingly difficult to collect tribute from territories struggling with environmental and political crises. Military costs increased as the kingdom faced both external threats and internal rebellions, creating a financial crisis that undermined administrative capabilities. Internal rebellions accelerated the decline. Provincial governors, facing their own local challenges, began acting independently.
Some allied with the Almoravids to secure their positions. Others declared independence and sought new commercial partners. Still others formed alliances with emerging rival powers that promised better terms. By the early 12th century, Ouagadougou was no longer a unified empire, but a collection of competing kingdoms loosely connected by commercial relationships and cultural ties. The great capital of Kumbi was gradually abandoned, its population scattered to smaller settlements that could better survive the new political and environmental realities. The complex administrative systems that had once managed a continental power collapsed into local structures. Yet this collapse created opportunities as much as it destroyed them. Commercial networks didn't disappear, they evolved and adapted to new circumstances. Administrative techniques developed over centuries were adopted by successor states. The cultural exchanges that had enriched cosmopolitan cities continued in new forms as merchants and scholars sought new centers of learning and commerce. As the old authority crumbled, the political landscape of West Africa became a chessboard of competing ambitions. Multiple kingdoms emerged, each believing it could become the next great power. The stakes were enormous. Control over the salt-precious metal exchange could make a kingdom wealthy beyond imagination, while failure meant marginalization or conquest. In the West, the kingdom of Takru had been growing in power and influence throughout the decline. Located in the Senegal River Valley, Takru controlled important routes and had developed formidable military capabilities. The kingdom had converted to Islam early, giving it diplomatic advantages in dealing with North African states and Almoravid authorities. Takru's rulers saw themselves as the natural successors and began expanding their influence eastward, seeking to recreate the commercial empire that had brought such wealth. To the east, the early Shanghai city-states around Gao were also positioning themselves for greatness.
These communities controlled commerce along the Niger River and had developed sophisticated naval capabilities that gave them advantages in riverine warfare. Their strategic location provided access to both trans-Saharan routes and river business that connected the Sahel to forest regions. Shanghai merchants were already establishing networks that bypassed traditional controlled passages. But the most immediate threat to regional stability came from an unexpected direction: the Soso Kingdom under King Sumangaru. Unlike other successor states that sought to recreate the commercial empire, Sumangaru represented a fundamentally different approach to power. Sumangaru was a traditional ruler who rejected both Islamic influence and the diplomatic accommodations that had characterized the previous approach to governance. Instead, he believed in conquest through superior military force and the direct subjugation of rival kingdoms. The Soso had developed advanced metallurgical techniques, producing superior iron weapons and tools that gave them significant military advantages over their neighbors. Under Sumangaru's leadership, the Soso began an aggressive expansion campaign that transformed the political landscape. They conquered territory after territory, imposing harsh tribute demands and showing little tolerance for local customs or autonomous rule. Unlike the flexible administration that had adapted to local conditions, Soso rule was direct and oppressive. Local rulers were replaced with Soso governors who answered directly to Sumangaru. Traditional religious practices were suppressed in favor of Soso customs. Heavy tribute payments drained conquered territories of their wealth without providing corresponding benefits. The Soso military machine was both impressive and terrifying. Sumangaru's army combined traditional infantry with cavalry units armed with superior iron weapons, forged using advanced techniques. The king himself was said to be a master of both metallurgy and magic, capable of producing weapons that could cut through any armor and spells that could turn the tide of battle. Whether or not the magical claims were true, the Soso certainly possessed ironworking technology that gave them genuine tactical advantages. Sumangaru's reputation for supernatural power became a crucial element of Soso military strategy. He cultivated an aura of invincibility through carefully orchestrated displays of technological superiority and psychological warfare. His court was filled with mysterious rituals and demonstrations designed to intimidate potential enemies. Captured weapons would be publicly destroyed by Soso blades, while prisoners were forced to witness displays of Soso military technology before being released to spread word of Sumangaru's power.
But the Soso approach created serious long-term problems. Unlike the previous empire, which had maintained power through accommodation and mutual benefit, the Sioux ruled through fear and exploitation. This generated widespread resentment among conquered peoples who had no stake in the kingdom's success. The harsh methods also required maintaining large military forces to suppress constant rebellions, which was extremely expensive and logistically challenging across vast territories. Intelligence networks throughout the region reported growing discontent with Soso rule. Local leaders who had initially submitted to Sumangaru were secretly communicating with potential allies. Commercial networks were being disrupted by heavy-handed Soso administration, creating economic problems that affected everyone. Even some Soso provincial governors were beginning to question their king's methods as they struggled to maintain order in restive territories. The most significant resistance to Soso expansion came from an unlikely source, the small kingdom of Kangaba, located in what is now the border region between Mali and Guinea. The Mandinka people had lived in the region around their homeland for centuries, developing a sophisticated society that balanced traditional beliefs with adaptation to changing circumstances. Unlike many of their neighbors, the Mandinka had not been significantly disrupted by the previous empire's collapse or the Almoravid invasions. Their territory was far enough from the main commercial routes to avoid direct conquest during the initial period of upheaval, but close enough to benefit from business opportunities and observe the rise and fall of neighboring powers. This small kingdom was not impressive by the standards of the great commercial centers. It controlled a relatively modest territory and had a smaller population compared to the major powers, but it possessed several crucial advantages that would prove decisive in the coming struggle for regional dominance. The Mandinka had developed a unique social structure that combined flexibility with stability. Their society was organized around extended family groups called clans, each with specific roles and responsibilities that contributed to the community's overall welfare. The Nyamaka artisan groups, including blacksmiths, leatherworkers, and musicians, held special status as masters of essential crafts. This caste system created social cohesion while allowing for specialization and innovation that kept Mandinka's society competitive with larger neighbors. The role of griots, professional historians and musicians, was particularly important to Mandinka political organization. These men and women served as living libraries, preserving oral traditions that maintained cultural identity across generations and political changes. They also functioned as diplomats and negotiators, using their respected status to mediate disputes and forge alliances between different groups. The griot tradition meant that Mandinka society had sophisticated mechanisms for conflict resolution and political coordination that could operate across clan and regional boundaries. Mandinka military organization reflected their society's emphasis on flexibility and adaptation. They combined traditional hunting skills with organized warfare techniques, creating forces that could operate effectively in both forest and savanna environments. Their intimate knowledge of local geography gave them significant advantages when fighting on home territory, while their decentralized command structure made them difficult for enemies to defeat through single decisive battles. Perhaps most importantly, the Mandinka had maintained their independence while remaining open to outside influences. They had adopted useful Islamic practices without abandoning traditional beliefs that remained central to their identity. They participated in regional commercial networks without becoming dependent on them for survival. They observed the rise and fall of neighboring kingdoms and systematically learned from both their successes and failures. The Mandinka caste system was more complex and flexible than outsiders often realized. While people were generally born into specific social roles, mechanisms existed for social mobility and adaptation to changing circumstances. Skilled artisans could gain wealth and influence that elevated their status. Military prowess could transform a person's position within society. Strategic marriage alliances could create new political opportunities for entire families. Women played crucial roles in Mandinka society that would later influence Mali's structure.
They could own property,
engage in long-distance commerce, and participate in political decisions that affected their communities. Queen mothers held significant authority in royal courts, while female merchants traveled extensive networks, gathering intelligence and building commercial relationships that supported political alliances. This relatively high status for women created a larger pool of talent for political and economic leadership. Religious practices among the Mandinka reflected their adaptability and pragmatism. Traditional beliefs centered on ancestor veneration and the spiritual significance of the natural world continued alongside growing Islamic influence brought by merchants and scholars. Rather than seeing these traditions as contradictory, the Mandinka developed syncretic practices that incorporated elements of both belief systems. This religious flexibility would later become a defining characteristic of Mali's culture. Their homeland had also developed effective diplomatic techniques that set them apart from purely military-focused neighbors. Rather than relying solely on conquest, Mandinka rulers used marriage alliances, commercial relationships, and cultural exchanges to build networks of allies and clients. These diplomatic skills would prove essential when facing the threat of Sosu expansion. As Sumanguru's forces began threatening Mandinka territory in the early 13th century, the conditions were developing for a confrontation that would determine the future of West Africa. The Sosu had superior military technology, proven conquest capabilities, and a reputation for invincibility that intimidated potential enemies. But the Mandinka possessed something equally valuable: a unified society, effective leadership, and a deep understanding of how to build lasting political institutions. The Mandinka leadership understood that direct confrontation with the Sosu would be suicidal unless conditions were carefully prepared. Instead, they began building a coalition of resistance that would eventually challenge Sosu dominance through coordinated action rather than isolated heroics. The process of coalition building required all the diplomatic skills the Mandinka had developed over generations. Marriage alliances were negotiated with neighboring kingdoms that also faced Sosu threats. Commercial relationships were used to gather intelligence about Sosu military movements and internal politics. Religious networks, both traditional and Islamic, were mobilized to build support for coordinated resistance. Military preparations proceeded alongside diplomatic efforts. The Mandinka developed new tactical approaches designed to neutralize Sosu advantages while maximizing their own strengths. They recruited allies who brought specialized military skills, cavalry units, archer companies, and infantry trained in different fighting techniques. Weapons and supplies were stockpiled in hidden locations while maintaining the appearance of submission to Sosu authority. By 1235, the conditions had developed for a decisive confrontation. The Sosu remained militarily powerful, but their political position was deteriorating as resentment grew throughout their territories. The Mandinka coalition was growing stronger and more confident, unified by shared opposition to Sosu oppression and the promise of a different kind of state based on cooperation rather than exploitation. The stage was set for the emergence of a leader who could unite the resistance and create a new model of power that would endure for centuries. That leader's name was Sundiata Keita, and his story would become the founding legend of the greatest empire medieval Africa had ever seen. The name Sundiata Keita would echo through the centuries, carried forward by Griot, whose voices transformed historical memory into living legend. But in the early 13th century, the future founder of Mali was still a young prince in the small kingdom of Kangaba, watching as the Soso king's forces closed in on his homeland like storm clouds gathering before a tempest. The epic that bears his name is far more than entertainment or mythology. It is the constitutional foundation of what would become the greatest power in medieval Africa. Within its verses lie the political principles, social contracts, and governmental structures that would guide the emerging realm for centuries. The griots who preserved these stories weren't simply entertainers. They were the keepers of a political charter that defined how a vast and diverse territory should be governed. According to the oral traditions, the prince's path to power began with personal struggle that mirrored the broader crisis facing his people. Born with physical disabilities that prevented him from walking normally, the young heir was initially dismissed by many as unsuitable for leadership. His father, Nariman Konate, ruled Kangaba during the early phases of Soso expansion, struggling to maintain independence while neighboring kingdoms fell one by one to Sumanguru's forces. The story of this transformation from disabled child to mighty warrior carries deep political meaning. His eventual triumph over physical limitation symbolized the people's potential to overcome seemingly impossible odds through determination, unity, and spiritual strength. The epic emphasizes that true power comes not from brute force or inherited privilege, but from the ability to inspire others and build lasting institutions. When the Soso armies finally invaded Kangaba, they found a kingdom prepared for both resistance and transformation. The attacking forces quickly overwhelmed the traditional defenses and drove the royal family into exile. But this apparent defeat became the catalyst for something unprecedented in West African politics: the creation of an alliance that would unite diverse peoples under a new kind of leadership. During his years in exile, the future emperor accomplished what no previous leader had managed. He built alliances that transcended the traditional boundaries of clan, kingdom, and ethnicity. The exiled prince traveled throughout the region seeking support among rulers who had lost their independence to the So king's oppression. But instead of simply promising military assistance, he offered something far more valuable: a vision of shared governance that would protect local autonomy while creating unprecedented collective strength. The political philosophy that emerged during this period would become known as the Manden Charter, Okurukan Fuga. This oral constitution established principles that were revolutionary for their time and place. It guaranteed basic rights for all people, regardless of social status. It protected women's property rights and established their authority in domestic and economic matters. It created mechanisms for resolving conflicts between different groups without resorting to warfare. Perhaps most importantly, the charter established environmental protections that reflected the understanding of sustainable resource management. Certain trees could not be cut without community permission. Hunting was regulated to prevent the extinction of animal populations. Water sources were protected as community resources that no individual could monopolize. The charter also codified social relations in ways that promoted stability while allowing for adaptation. The Nyamakala artisan castes were guaranteed special protection and autonomy in exchange for their essential services. The griot class received formal recognition as the guardians of history and law, giving them authority to mediate disputes and preserve cultural memory. Slavery was regulated rather than abolished, but the document established rights for enslaved people and mechanisms for gaining freedom. These weren't abstract principles, but practical guidelines for governing a diverse population. The charter recognized that different communities had different traditions and allowed for local variations while establishing overarching standards that applied to everyone. This flexibility would prove crucial as the emerging realm expanded to encompass dozens of different ethnic groups, each with their own customs and beliefs. The alliance that formed around the exiled prince's leadership reflected these inclusive principles. Traditional clans provided the core of support, but the partnership soon included Fulani pastoralists, Soninka merchants, Bamana farmers, and even some Soso nobles who had grown disillusioned with their king's methods. Each group brought specific skills and resources while maintaining their cultural identity within the larger framework. Military organization reflected this diversity. Indigenous forces provided expertise in forest warfare and guerrilla tactics. Fulani allies contributed cavalry units and knowledge of livestock management that supported long campaigns. Soninka merchants brought intelligence networks and logistical support. Former Soso soldiers added knowledge of metallurgy and siege techniques. The alliance's intelligence networks proved particularly valuable as they prepared for the inevitable confrontation with the tyrant king. Spies reported growing discontent within Soso territory as harsh rule generated widespread resentment. Economic problems were mounting as heavy taxation and forced labor disrupted normal agricultural and commercial activities. Even within the king's court, moderate voices were questioning the sustainability of ruling through fear and oppression. By 1235, the conditions were optimal for open rebellion. The Soso forces were stretched thin across vast territories, suppressing constant uprisings and defending long supply lines. The resistance movement had grown strong enough to challenge Suso dominance while offering subject peoples an attractive alternative to continued oppression. The decisive confrontation came at Karina, near the present-day border between Mali and Guinea. The battle would determine not just military supremacy, but which model of governance would shape West Africa's future. The Soso king represented the old way of ruling through individual power and technological superiority. The exiled prince embodied a new approach based on collective action and inclusive institutions. The Battle of Karina was as much a clash of political philosophies as military strategies. The Soso forces were still formidable, equipped with superior iron weapons and organized around traditional command structures that emphasized individual heroism and technological advantage. The king himself appeared on the battlefield wearing his legendary iron armor and wielding weapons forged using secret metallurgical techniques. But the Allied forces had developed tactical innovations that neutralized many Soso advantages. Instead of meeting the enemy in open battle, where superior weapons would be decisive, they used terrain and local knowledge to create favorable conditions. Coordinated attacks by different allied groups prevented the king from concentrating his forces effectively. Most importantly, the alliance's diverse composition meant they could adapt quickly to changing battlefield conditions. The psychological dimension of the conflict was equally important. The Soso ruler had built his reputation on supernatural power and invincibility, using fear as a weapon of conquest. But the resistance movement's inclusive approach had generated genuine enthusiasm among its supporters, creating morale advantages that offset technological disadvantages. According to the epic traditions, the turning point came when the future emperor demonstrated that his enemy's power was not truly supernatural. Whether through superior intelligence about Soso metallurgy or genuine mystical abilities, The prince proved that his opponent's weapons and armor could be defeated through proper tactics and preparation. The victory at Karina was total and decisive. The Soso army was destroyed, and their king disappeared from history. Whether killed in battle, executed afterward, or fled into exile remains unknown. More importantly, the harsh Soso administrative system collapsed immediately, leaving vast territories without effective government. But the real achievement began after the military victory ended. Instead of simply replacing Soso oppression with his own domination, the victorious leader implemented the inclusive vision that had united the resistance. Local rulers who submitted to the new order were allowed to maintain authority over their traditional territories. Cultural and religious practices were protected rather than suppressed. The tribute system was designed to be sustainable rather than exploitative. The early governmental structure reflected lessons learned from both Ghana's successes and the Soso failure. Like the old commercial realm, the new empire would control trade routes and collect taxes from merchants. But unlike previous systems, the administration would invest heavily in infrastructure and services that benefited subject populations. Roads would be maintained and protected. Markets would be regulated fairly. Disputes would be resolved through established legal procedures rather than arbitrary force. Provincial administration balanced central control with local autonomy. Governors appointed by the emperor managed broad policy implementation and collected tribute, but traditional rulers retained authority over day-to-day governance and cultural matters. This system prevented the center from becoming overwhelmed with local details, while ensuring that imperial policies were adapted to regional conditions. The military organization that emerged from the resistance movement became a model for imperial expansion. Rather than maintaining a single large army, the empire developed multiple specialized forces adapted to different types of warfare and terrain. River fleets controlled waterways and transported troops and supplies. Cavalry units provided rapid response capabilities and projected power across open terrain. Infantry forces garrisoned key positions and provided security for trade routes. Most innovatively, the empire incorporated soldiers from conquered territories rather than simply imposing external control. Local warriors who proved their loyalty could advance to positions of responsibility, creating pathways for integration that reduced resentment and rebellion. This approach also provided the empire with detailed knowledge of local conditions and potential threats.
The economic foundations established during this crucial period would support imperial expansion for centuries. Control over the Bambuk and Bure gold fields provided the basic wealth necessary to fund governmental operations. But the new system went beyond simple resource extraction to create value-added services that increased overall prosperity. The empire's position along major trade routes generated revenue through taxation and fees. But the government also invested in infrastructure that made commerce more efficient and profitable. Caravanserais provided secure lodging for traveling merchants. Wells and bridges facilitated movement across difficult terrain. Standardized weights and measures reduced transaction costs and prevented disputes. The tribute system was carefully designed to be sustainable and fair. Different regions contributed according to their capabilities and resources. Agricultural areas provided food supplies and fiber crops. Mining regions contributed precious metals and salt. Commercial centers paid monetary taxes based on business volumes. This diversity reduced the realm's vulnerability to disruptions in any single economic sector. Currency policies reflected the empire's role as a commercial intermediary between different economic systems. Multiple forms of money were recognized and regulated, allowing merchants from various backgrounds to conduct business efficiently. Gold dust remained the standard for high-value transactions, while salt bars, cowrie shells, and cloth strips served specific regional markets. The religious policies implemented during this formative period established patterns that would characterize the empire throughout its existence. Rather than imposing a single belief system, the government protected religious diversity while promoting practices that supported political unity and social harmony. Traditional African religious practices continued to flourish under imperial protection. Ancestor veneration remained central to family and clan relationships. Seasonal festivals that celebrated agricultural cycles received official support. Sacred groves and ritual sites were protected from commercial exploitation. Islamic practices were equally welcomed and supported. Mosques were built in commercial centers and administrative capitals. Muslim merchants and scholars received protection and encouragement. Islamic law was recognized in commercial disputes and personal matters for those who chose to follow it. The syncretic practices that emerged from this religious tolerance became distinctively characteristic of the new realm. Rulers participated in both traditional ceremonies and Islamic rituals, demonstrating respect for different belief systems. Government policies incorporated both traditional ecological wisdom and Islamic legal principles. Cultural celebrations combined elements from multiple traditions. This religious flexibility served important political purposes. It prevented the religious conflicts that had contributed to Ghana's decline. It attracted support from diverse populations who saw their beliefs respected rather than suppressed. It facilitated commercial relationships with both traditional African societies and the Islamic world. The social structure that crystallized under the new leadership balanced hierarchy with mobility in ways that promoted stability while allowing for adaptation. The traditional caste system provided social organization and economic specialization, but mechanisms existed for individuals to improve their status through exceptional service or achievement. The Nyamakala artisan groups maintained their special status and protection while taking on new roles in the expanding realm. Blacksmiths became essential to military production and technological innovation. Leather workers created the products necessary for long-distance travel and warfare. Musicians and storytellers served as diplomats and cultural ambassadors. Women's roles expanded significantly under the new system. The Mandan Charter's protections for female property rights created opportunities for women to become independently wealthy through commerce and agriculture. Queen mothers gained formal authority in succession decisions and diplomatic relationships. Female merchants traveled throughout the growing territory, gathering intelligence and building networks that supported both commerce and governance. The slave systems that developed were more regulated and less harsh than in many contemporary societies. While slavery wasn't abolished, enslaved people had legal protections and multiple pathways to freedom. Military service could lead to manumission and advancement. Skilled craftsmanship provided opportunities for semi-independent status. Children of mixed marriages often gained full freedom and citizenship. Educational systems emerged that combined traditional knowledge transmission with new imperial needs. Go continued their crucial role as keepers of history and law, but their training expanded to include information about the growing territories, diverse populations, and customs. Islamic schools taught literacy and numeracy that supported commercial and administrative activities. Craft guilds maintained technical knowledge while adapting to new technologies and materials. The legal system that developed during this period combined traditional dispute resolution with imperial standardization. Local communities retained authority over internal matters and minor disputes. Traditional elders and Go continued to mediate conflicts using customary law and oral precedent. But major crimes and intercommunal disputes were handled by imperial courts that applied consistent standards across the realm. Commercial law received particular attention as trade volumes increased dramatically. Standard contracts were developed for different types of business relationships. Dispute resolution procedures were established for conflicts between merchants from different regions or cultural backgrounds. Weights and measures were standardized and enforced to prevent fraud and misunderstandings. The diplomatic innovations of this era established the empire as a major power in regional and international affairs. Rather than simply demanding submission from neighboring kingdoms, the new realm offered mutual benefit agreements that created networks of allies and trading partners. Marriage diplomacy became a sophisticated tool for building lasting relationships. Strategic unions created kinship ties that lasted for generations and provided peaceful mechanisms for resolving disputes. The children of these diplomatic marriages often became cultural bridges who facilitated communication and understanding between different groups. Commercial diplomacy proved equally effective. The empire's growing control over trade routes gave it leverage in negotiations with both suppliers and customers. But rather than exploiting this position for short-term gain, imperial policy focused on creating stable, profitable relationships that benefited all parties. The early diplomatic relationships established during this period would prove crucial as expansion continued. Treaties with North African states provided security for long-distance trade and access to Mediterranean markets. Agreements with forest kingdoms secured supplies of kola nuts, ivory, and other valued products. Alliances with Saharan peoples ensured safe passage for caravans crossing the desert. By the time of the founder's death around 1255, the foundations were firmly established for what would become medieval Africa's greatest power. The political institutions created during his reign would prove flexible enough to govern vast territories encompassing dozens of different ethnic groups and cultural traditions. The economic systems would generate the wealth necessary to support continued expansion and internal development. The diplomatic networks would provide the international relationships necessary for the empire to become a major player in world affairs. The transformation from the small kingdom of Kangaba to the emerging realm represented more than just military conquest or political expansion. It marked the creation of new forms of governance that balanced unity with diversity, strength with flexibility, and tradition with innovation. The principles established during these crucial decades would guide the empire through centuries of growth and prosperity, creating a legacy that would influence West African political thought long after the power itself had faded. The legend of the great founder would continue to inspire future generations. But his most important achievement was not mythical heroism, but practical statesmanship. He had proven that diverse peoples could unite under shared institutions while maintaining their distinct identities. He had demonstrated that sustainable governance required cooperation rather than oppression. Most importantly, he had established the foundations for a realm that would grow to encompass much of West Africa, while maintaining the political flexibility necessary to adapt to changing circumstances and challenges. The death of the great founder in 1255 could have marked the end of the remarkable experiment in inclusive governance. Many kingdoms throughout history had collapsed when their charismatic leaders passed away, fragmenting into competing factions that destroyed everything their predecessors had built.
But the institutions established during those crucial early decades proved more durable than anyone could have imagined. The succession passed smoothly to Mansa, demonstrating that the political structures created were strong enough to survive transitions of power. The new ruler inherited not just a throne, but a sophisticated governmental system capable of managing vast territories and diverse populations. More importantly, he inherited a vision of expansion that would transform a regional power into a continental realm. The first great test of this vision came with the campaign to control Gao, the strategic city-state that commanded commerce along the eastern bend of the Niger River. For centuries, Gao had maintained its independence by playing larger powers against each other while profiting from its position as a commercial crossroads. The city's rulers had watched the rise of the new Western power with growing concern, recognizing that their traditional strategy of diplomatic neutrality would not survive in a world increasingly dominated by centralized authorities. The conquest of Gao revealed the innovations that had emerged from the original resistance movement against the Soso. Rather than relying on massive armies that moved slowly and consumed enormous resources, the realm's forces employed coordinated strikes by specialized units adapted to different types of terrain and warfare. The river fleet that approached Gao from the west represented a revolution in African warfare technology. These weren't simple fishing boats pressed into service, but purpose-built vessels designed for transporting troops, supplies, and siege equipment along the Niger's complex network of channels and seasonal flooding patterns. The boats were constructed using techniques borrowed from multiple traditions: hull designs from river communities, sail configurations adapted from desert nomads, and weapon mounts inspired by North African naval warfare. The naval campaign demonstrated the logistical advantages that would characterize expansion for the next century. While enemy forces were limited to land-based supply lines that could be easily disrupted, the attacking fleet could maintain secure communications and supply routes along waterways that stretched back to the heartland. This capability allowed commanders to sustain sieges and campaigns that would have been impossible using traditional methods. The Siege of Gao also showcased innovations in combined arms tactics that integrated different fighting traditions into cohesive forces. Cavalry units from pastoral allies provided mobility and shock power on open ground around the city. Infantry forces drawn from agricultural communities used their knowledge of earthworks and fortification to conduct systematic siege operations. Archers from forest regions provided specialized skills in urban warfare, where traditional cavalry charges were ineffective. Perhaps most importantly, the campaign demonstrated the intelligence advantages that came from governing diverse populations. The attacking forces included soldiers and advisors who spoke the languages and understood the customs of Gao's inhabitants. This knowledge allowed commanders to exploit internal divisions within the city while offering attractive terms to groups willing to cooperate with the new order. The fall of Gao in 1275 marked more than just victory. It represented the successful integration of a major commercial center into the expanding system. Rather than looting the city or replacing its population, government officials immediately began implementing the inclusive policies that had proven successful in other conquered territories. Local merchants were guaranteed protection and access to the realm's expanding commercial networks. Traditional rulers who submitted were allowed to maintain authority over community affairs while accepting oversight on broader policy matters. Cultural practices were protected with both traditional shrines and the growing Islamic community receiving official support and recognition. The economic integration of Gao demonstrated the sophisticated commercial policies that were emerging as hallmarks of governments. The city's strategic location made it a natural hub for commerce between the Sahel and forest regions. But government investment transformed it into something far more significant: a central node in a continental commercial network. Engineers immediately began improving Gao's harbor facilities to accommodate the larger vessels that were becoming standard for long-distance river transport. Warehouses were constructed using architectural techniques borrowed from multiple traditions, creating storage facilities that could handle the volume and variety of goods flowing through the expanded networks.
Buildings housed the growing bureaucracy necessary to manage customs, taxation, and commercial law across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The success at Gao encouraged similar campaigns against other strategic cities throughout the region. Janai, the ancient commercial center located in the inland delta of the Niger River, presented different challenges that tested the realm's adaptability and diplomatic skills. Janai had been a major center for centuries before the realm's emergence, with a sophisticated urban culture that combined traditional African architecture with Islamic commercial practices. The city's wealth came not just from its strategic location, but from specialized craft production that supplied markets throughout West Africa. Janai's textiles, metalwork, and leather goods were prized from the Mediterranean coast to the forest kingdoms of the south. The campaign against Janai revealed the realm's growing sophistication in what would later be called economic warfare.
Rather than immediately resorting to siege, strategists used their control over routes to gradually isolate the city from its traditional commercial partners. Caravans were redirected to controlled markets. Credit arrangements were offered to merchants willing to relocate their operations. Alternative sources were developed for products that had traditionally come through Genet's networks. This economic pressure campaign demonstrated understanding that sustainable conquest required more than victory. By gradually weakening Genet's economic position while offering attractive alternatives, negotiators created conditions where surrender became preferable to continued resistance. When Genet's rulers finally submitted in 1282, they did so as partners rather than conquered enemies. The terms of integration allowed the city to maintain its commercial autonomy while accepting protection and contributing to the broader economic system. This arrangement proved beneficial to all parties. Genet gained access to expanded markets and security, while the realm acquired a major commercial center without the costs and disruptions of prolonged warfare. The integration of Genet also revealed growing capabilities in cultural synthesis. The city's Islamic scholarly traditions were incorporated into the educational system, creating centers of learning that attracted students from across West Africa. Traditional craft techniques were preserved and promoted, with government support helping Genet's artisans expand their markets throughout the territories. The architectural innovations that emerged from this cultural exchange would become characteristic of the realm's style. Traditional African building techniques were combined with Islamic architectural elements and governmental requirements to create structures that were both functional and symbolically powerful. The Great Mosque of Genet, rebuilt during this period with official support, became a model for sacred architecture throughout the territories. As these major cities fell under control, the challenge shifted from conquest to governance. Managing diverse populations across vast distances required innovations that went beyond traditional African political structures. The solutions that emerged would influence theory and practice throughout the medieval world. The provincial system that developed during this period balanced central control with local autonomy in ways that prevented both fragmentation and oppression. Governors appointed by the ruler were responsible for implementing broad policies, collecting tribute, and maintaining security. But these officials worked alongside traditional rulers who retained authority over local customs, spiritual practices, and community affairs. This dual system created multiple pathways for advancement and participation in governance. Traditional elites who demonstrated loyalty and competence could advance to positions in the central government. Successful officials often married into local ruling families, creating kinship ties that strengthened political bonds. Merit-based appointments allowed talented individuals from various backgrounds to rise in service. The tribute system that emerged was far more sophisticated than simple tax collection. Different regions contributed according to their resources and capabilities. But the government also invested heavily in infrastructure and services that increased overall productivity and prosperity. Roads were built and maintained to facilitate commerce and communication. Markets were established and regulated to ensure fair practices.
Legal systems were developed to resolve disputes across cultural and linguistic boundaries. Currency policies reflected the realm's role as a bridge between different economic systems. Gold dust remained the standard for major transactions, but the government also regulated and supported regional currencies that served local needs. Salt bars continued to circulate in areas where they had traditional acceptance. Cowrie shells were imported and distributed to facilitate small-scale commerce. Cloth strips served as currency in regions where textile production was important. The armed forces that supported this expansion were unlike anything previously seen in West Africa. Rather than maintaining a single large army, the realm developed multiple specialized forces and adapted to different types of warfare and terrain. This approach provided strategic flexibility while reducing the enormous costs of keeping large numbers of soldiers permanently under arms. The river fleet became the backbone of power, providing rapid transport for troops and supplies while maintaining secure communications across vast distances. These vessels were staffed by professional sailors drawn from river communities throughout the territories, creating a force that was both technically skilled and politically reliable. Cavalry units were organized around the pastoral expertise of allied groups, particularly the Fulani, who had joined the original resistance movement. These forces provided the mobility necessary to respond quickly to threats and project power across open terrain. The integration of different pastoral traditions also created innovations in animal husbandry and logistics that supported extended campaigns. Infantry forces were recruited from agricultural communities, but trained to operate in various environments. These soldiers provided the disciplined formations necessary for siege warfare while also serving as garrison troops who maintained order in conquered territories. The recruitment system created pathways for social advancement while ensuring that service strengthened rather than undermined community ties. The intelligence networks that supported operations were perhaps the realm's most innovative organizational achievement. Rather than relying solely on formal diplomatic channels, officials cultivated extensive informal networks that provided detailed information about political, economic, and social conditions throughout the region. Merchants served as natural intelligence agents, reporting on political developments, economic opportunities, and potential threats in the territories they visited. Spiritual leaders, both traditional and Islamic, provided information about community sentiments and cultural changes. Craftspeople who traveled between different regions contributed knowledge about technological innovations and resource availability. This intelligence system provided decision-makers with unprecedented information about conditions throughout their territories and beyond. Early warning of droughts, political instability, or threats allowed the government to respond proactively rather than reactively. Knowledge of economic opportunities enabled policies that maximized prosperity and growth. The spiritual policies that evolved during this expansion period demonstrated the realm's commitment to the inclusive principles established by the founder. Rather than imposing uniformity, officials actively supported diversity while promoting practices that enhanced political unity and social harmony. Traditional African practices received official protection and support. Sacred sites were preserved and maintained. Seasonal festivals were incorporated into calendars.
Traditional priests and healers were recognized as important community leaders whose authority complemented rather than competed with governance. Islamic practices were equally encouraged and supported. Mosques were built in major cities and commercial centers. Islamic scholars were recruited and supported as teachers and legal advisors. Pilgrimages to Mecca were facilitated through diplomatic relationships with North African and Middle Eastern powers. The syncretic practices that emerged from this tolerance became distinctively characteristic of the realm's culture. Rulers participated in both traditional ceremonies and Islamic rituals. Government policies incorporated both traditional ecological wisdom and Islamic legal principles.
Cultural celebrations combined elements from multiple spiritual traditions. This flexibility served crucial political and economic purposes. It prevented the conflicts that had weakened previous powers. It attracted support from diverse populations who saw their beliefs respected rather than suppressed. It facilitated commercial relationships with both traditional African societies and the broader Islamic world. The conversion processes that occurred were gradual and voluntary, rather than forced or systematic. Many people adopted Islamic practices for practical reasons. Islamic law provided useful frameworks for business relationships, and membership in the Islamic community offered access to international networks. But these conversions rarely involved complete abandonment of traditional beliefs and practices. Instead, most people developed syncretic identities that incorporated elements from multiple traditions. This creativity became a source of cultural innovation that enriched society. The educational systems that developed during this period reflected the realm's commitment to both preserving traditional knowledge and adapting to new circumstances. Griots continued their crucial role as keepers of oral history and law, but their training expanded to include information about the territory's diverse populations and evolving institutions. Islamic schools taught literacy, numeracy, and knowledge that were essential for commercial and governmental success. These institutions attracted students from throughout the realm and beyond, creating networks of educated individuals who facilitated communication and cooperation across cultural boundaries. Craft guilds maintain technical knowledge while adapting to new technologies and materials that became available through expanded networks. The guild system also provided mechanisms for technology transfer and innovation that strengthened economic competitiveness. By 1300, the realm had grown from a small kingdom centered around Kangaba to a vast territory that controlled much of the western Sudan and significant portions of the Sahel. The population under rule included dozens of different ethnic groups, multiple spiritual traditions, and economic systems ranging from pastoral nomadism to intensive agriculture to specialized craft production. The governmental innovations that made this expansion possible would continue to evolve as new challenges and opportunities arose. The systems developed during this period provided the foundation for even greater achievements under future rulers.
The forces perfected during these campaigns would enable the realm to project power across continental distances. The commercial networks established would generate the wealth necessary to support one of the most spectacular displays of power in medieval history. The transformation from regional kingdom to continental realm represented more than just territorial expansion. It demonstrated the practical viability of inclusive governance that respected diversity while maintaining political unity. The institutions developed during this period would prove resilient enough to survive political crises, environmental challenges, and external threats that would have destroyed less flexible systems. Most importantly, the realm had established itself as a major player in international affairs, with diplomatic relations that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean. The stage was set for the emergence of a ruler who would use this foundation to project power onto the world stage in ways that would astonish contemporaries and influence global history. The man who would become known as the richest individual in human history inherited more than just political power. He commanded an economic engine that had been generations in the making. The new ruler's rise to power revealed the maturity of the succession systems established decades earlier. Unlike many medieval kingdoms where royal transitions sparked civil wars and fragmentation, the transfer of authority proceeded smoothly through established institutional channels. This stability reflected the deep roots that the governmental structure had developed throughout the territories under central control. His background prepared the emperor exceptionally well for the challenges he would face. As a member of the royal family, he had received education in both traditional governance and Islamic scholarship.
His training included exposure to the complex commercial networks that generated the realm's wealth, diplomatic protocols for managing relationships with diverse populations, and strategic thinking about projecting power across vast distances. The economic foundation that the new emperor inherited was staggering in its scope and sophistication. The gold fields of Bambuk and Bude were producing unprecedented quantities of the precious metal, while expanded mining operations had discovered new deposits throughout the territory. But this raw treasure was only part of a much larger economic system that included agricultural surpluses, manufacturing centers, and commercial networks that stretched across continents. Agricultural productivity had increased dramatically through innovations in farming techniques, irrigation systems, and crop diversification. The empire's farmers were producing not just enough food to support large urban populations, but also cash crops like cotton that supplied textile industries throughout West Africa. Livestock herds had expanded under improved management practices, providing both food supplies and trade goods. Manufacturing had evolved from local craft production to organized industries that served regional and international markets. Textile production centers were creating fabrics that competed with imports from North Africa and the Middle East. Metalwork industries were producing tools, weapons, and decorative items that demonstrated both technical skill and artistic sophistication. Leather goods, pottery, and woodwork from the empire's workshops were prized throughout the known world. The commercial networks that tied these diverse economic activities together had become marvels of organization and efficiency. Merchant associations regulated standards and practices while facilitating credit and information exchange. Transportation systems moved goods efficiently across vast distances using combinations of river transport, caravan routes, and emerging road networks. Market towns provided secure facilities for commerce while collecting taxes that supported governmental operations. Currency systems had evolved to accommodate the growing complexity and scale of economic activity. While precious metal dust remained the standard for major transactions, regional currencies served local needs and facilitated trade with neighboring societies. The government's monetary policies balanced the need for stable value with the flexibility required for conducting business across cultural and linguistic boundaries. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the economic system was its integration with political and social institutions. Rather than simply extracting riches for the benefit of ruling elites, the economy was structured to support broad-based prosperity that strengthened social cohesion and political stability. Infrastructure investments improved productivity and quality of life for ordinary citizens. Educational institutions created the human capital necessary for continued economic development. Legal systems protected property rights and contract enforcement while promoting fair business practices. This economic foundation provided the emperor with resources that exceeded those of most contemporary rulers. But material abundance alone does not explain the global impact of his reign. The new leader possessed vision and strategic thinking that would transform prosperity into international influence on an unprecedented scale. The decision to undertake the pilgrimage to Mecca represented far more than personal devotion or religious obligation. The journey that began in 1324 was carefully planned as a demonstration of power that would announce the realm's arrival as a major player in international affairs. Every aspect of the expedition was designed to showcase not just wealth, but also the sophisticated organizational capabilities that made such an undertaking possible. The planning phase alone required years of preparation and coordination across multiple governmental departments. Diplomatic negotiations were conducted with rulers along the proposed route to ensure safe passage and appropriate reception. Logistical arrangements were made for supplying and transporting what would become one of the largest organized expeditions in medieval history. Contemporary accounts describe a caravan that included 60,000 people, suggesting a level of organization and resource mobilization that rivaled the capabilities of the most powerful medieval states.
Participants represented a cross-section of the realm's population and included not just royal courtiers and guards, but also merchants, scholars, craftspeople, and ordinary citizens who had been selected to participate in this historic journey. The economic impact of the expedition was carefully calculated to achieve maximum political effect. The 500 servants who carried staffs topped with precious metal represented a display of wealth that would be immediately comprehensible to observers throughout the journey. But the distribution of this wealth was equally important. Generous gifts to local rulers and charitable donations to communities demonstrated both prosperity and generosity that enhanced the realm's reputation. The expedition's route through North Africa was chosen for strategic as well as practical reasons.
By traveling through major commercial and political centers, the caravan would encounter the maximum number of influential observers who could spread word of the realm's power and sophistication. The route also provided opportunities for diplomatic engagement and commercial relationship building that would have lasting benefits. When the expedition reached Cairo in 1324, the impact was immediate and overwhelming. The Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt and Syria, was one of the most powerful and sophisticated states in the medieval world. Its capital was a cosmopolitan center where merchants, scholars, and diplomats from across the known world conducted business and exchanged information. The arrival of such a magnificent expedition from sub-Saharan Africa challenged every assumption that local elites held about African societies and capabilities. The economic disruption caused by the expedition's generosity became legendary. The distribution of such large quantities of precious metal in Cairo's markets caused immediate inflation that affected prices for over a decade. Contemporary chroniclers recorded that the value of currency fell by 10 to 25%, representing one of the most dramatic episodes of monetary inflation in medieval history. But the economic impact was less important than the psychological and political effects. The demonstration of wealth on this scale forced a fundamental reassessment of Africa's place in the medieval world system. European and Middle Eastern elites who had previously viewed sub-Saharan Africa as a source of raw materials and slaves were suddenly confronted with evidence of sophisticated political organization, unprecedented prosperity. The diplomatic opportunities created by this dramatic entrance were skillfully exploited throughout the remainder of the journey. Meetings with the Mamluk Sultan and other regional leaders established formal relationships that would facilitate trade and cultural exchange for decades. Treaties were negotiated that provided security for merchants and pilgrims traveling between West Africa and the Middle East. Commercial agreements were established that gave the realm's traders preferential access to Egyptian and Syrian markets. The cultural exchange that occurred during the expedition's time in Cairo was equally significant. Scholars from the realm engaged with their counterparts in one of the medieval world's most important centers of learning. Technical knowledge was shared about everything from architecture and engineering to medicine and astronomy. Literary and artistic traditions were compared and cross-fertilized, creating new forms of cultural expression that would influence both societies. The religious dimensions of the journey were no less important than its political and economic aspects. The pilgrimage demonstrated the ruler's commitment to Islamic principles, while also showcasing the sophisticated religious culture that had developed within his territories. The expedition included prominent Islamic scholars whose learning impressed their Middle Eastern counterparts and helped establish the realm as a significant center of Islamic civilization. When the expedition finally reached Mecca, the impact was felt throughout the Islamic world. The presence of such a magnificent entourage from West Africa demonstrated the global reach of Islamic civilization while also highlighting the prosperity and sophistication of African Muslim societies. The charitable donations made during the pilgrimage established the ruler's reputation for generosity and piety that would influence Islamic opinion for generations. The return journey provided additional opportunities for diplomatic and commercial relationship building. Stops in various cities allowed for continued negotiations and cultural exchange. The expedition demonstrated wealth and organization, opened doors that had previously been closed to African traders and diplomats.
Commercial networks were established that would channel increasing volumes of trade between West Africa and the broader Islamic world. But perhaps the most significant impact of the pilgrimage was its effect on European perceptions of Africa. Word of the expedition's magnificence spread throughout the Mediterranean world and beyond.
challenging long-held assumptions about African societies and capabilities. The famous Catalan Atlas of 1375, which depicted the ruler holding a large nugget of precious metal, symbolized a fundamental shift in how Europeans understood Africa's place in the global economy. The architectural and cultural boom that followed the ruler's return demonstrated how international exposure could catalyze domestic development. The wealth and knowledge gained during the journey were invested in ambitious construction projects that transformed the realm's major cities. New architectural styles emerged that combined local traditions with techniques and aesthetic influences absorbed during the pilgrimage. The most famous of these projects was the expansion and rebuilding of the Sankora University complex in Timbuktu. The new construction incorporated architectural elements from multiple traditions while creating facilities that could accommodate the growing numbers of students and scholars attracted to the city. The university became one of the medieval world's most important centers of learning, with a library that reportedly contained hundreds of thousands of manuscripts covering subjects from Islamic law and theology to mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Similar construction projects transformed other major cities throughout the territories. Mosques were built or renovated using architectural techniques learned during the pilgrimage, creating distinctive styles that became characteristic of the realm's Islamic architecture. Palace complexes were expanded to accommodate the growing complexity of governmental operations and international diplomatic activity. Commercial facilities were improved to handle the increasing volumes of trade generated by enhanced international relationships. The cultural renaissance that accompanied these physical improvements was equally impressive. The scholars recruited during the pilgrimage established schools and research centers that attracted students from across the Islamic world. Literary production flourished as court poets and chroniclers created works that celebrated the realm's achievements while also preserving its history and traditions. Artistic production expanded to include new forms and techniques influenced by exposure to international artistic traditions. Educational reforms implemented during this period created systems that balanced local needs with international standards. Traditional forms of knowledge transmission were preserved and strengthened, while new curriculum was developed that prepared students for participation in international commercial and scholarly networks. Language instruction expanded to include Arabic literacy that was essential for advanced Islamic scholarship and international communication. Legal system reforms reflected the integration of local customary law with Islamic legal principles and international commercial practices. Courts were established that could handle complex commercial disputes involving parties from different cultural backgrounds. Legal codes were developed that provided consistent standards while maintaining flexibility for local conditions and customs. The economic policies implemented during this period leveraged the enhanced international relationships to maximize prosperity and growth. Trade agreements negotiated during the pilgrimage were implemented through commercial policies that facilitated international commerce while protecting local interests. Infrastructure investments supported the expansion of economic activity while also demonstrating the government's commitment to broad-based prosperity. Monetary policies were adjusted to accommodate the increased international activity while maintaining stability and predictability. The distribution of wealth from the pilgrimage was managed to avoid the kind of inflation that had affected Cairo, while still providing economic stimulus that supported growth and development. Currency regulations were updated to facilitate international transactions while protecting the integrity of local monetary systems. The diplomatic initiatives that followed the pilgrimage established the realm as a major player in international affairs. Formal relations were maintained with powers throughout North Africa and the Middle East through regular diplomatic exchanges and commercial agreements. Marriage alliances were negotiated that created kinship ties with prominent families in other societies.
Cultural exchange programs were established that facilitated ongoing learning and relationship building. Intelligence networks were expanded to gather information about political and economic developments throughout the region and beyond. This information supported strategic decision-making about everything from trade policies to diplomatic initiatives. The enhanced understanding of international conditions also enabled proactive responses to opportunities and challenges that affected the realm's interests. By the end of his reign in 1337, Musa Keita had transformed his inheritance from a regional power into a global force that commanded respect and attention throughout the known world. The wealth and sophisticated organization that he had demonstrated during his pilgrimage had established new standards for African achievement and capability. The cultural and educational institutions that he had founded continued to attract international attention and participation long after his death. But perhaps his most important achievement was the demonstration that African societies could compete successfully in the international arena while maintaining their distinctive cultural identities and political institutions. The synthesis of local traditions with international influences that characterized his reign became a model for cultural development that influenced African societies for centuries. The legacy of this remarkable ruler extended far beyond his own lifetime and territory. The international relationships that he had established provided the foundation for continued cultural and commercial exchange. The institutions that he had created or strengthened continued to serve as centers of learning and cultural production. The reputation for wealth and sophistication that he had established enhanced the standing of African societies throughout the medieval world. Most importantly, his reign had demonstrated the potential for African political organization and economic development on a scale that had previously been unimaginable. The transformation of a regional kingdom into a global power provided a model and inspiration for African achievement that would influence political and cultural development throughout the continent. The decades following the Great Pilgrimage witnessed an unprecedented flowering of urban civilization across the empire. The international attention generated by that spectacular journey had established the kingdom as a major power, but the true measure of its greatness lay in the sophisticated cities that emerged as centers of learning, commerce, and cultural innovation. These urban centers would become legendary throughout the medieval world, attracting scholars, merchants, and travelers from across Africa, the Middle East, and eventually Europe.
Timbuktu transformed from a modest trading post into one of the most cosmopolitan cities in the medieval world. Located at the strategic bend of the Niger River, where the waterway curves closest to the Sahara, the city occupied an ideal position for facilitating commerce between desert and river trade networks. But geography alone cannot explain its remarkable development. Deliberate investment in infrastructure, education, and cultural institutions created an urban environment that rivaled the great cities of Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad. The physical expansion of the city reflected careful urban planning that accommodated rapid population growth while maintaining livability and security. New residential quarters were laid out with attention to water supply, waste management, and fire prevention. Commercial districts were organized to facilitate different types of business while minimizing conflicts between competing interests. Religious and educational facilities were strategically placed to serve diverse populations while creating focal points for community identity. The Great Mosque that dominated the city's skyline represented architectural innovation that combined local building traditions with techniques learned through international contact. The distinctive style that emerged, characterized by wooden support beams protruding from mud brick walls and towering minarets that could be seen for miles across the flat landscape, became a symbol of the empire's cultural sophistication and Islamic commitment. But the mosque was much more than just a place of worship.
It anchored an educational complex that became known throughout the Islamic world as Sankora University. The institution grew organically from informal study circles into a structured center of learning that attracted students and scholars from across Africa and the Middle East. By the height of its influence, the university housed hundreds of thousands of manuscripts and supported scholarly communities that pushed the boundaries of knowledge in multiple fields. The library collections at Sankora represented one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements of the medieval world. Manuscripts were acquired through purchase, copying, and scholarly exchange networks that connected the city to centers of learning throughout the Islamic world. The collections included not just religious texts, but also works on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, philosophy, and literature. Local scholars contributed original works that added to this intellectual treasure, creating new knowledge while preserving and transmitting existing wisdom. The scholarly community that developed around these collections was remarkably diverse and dynamic. Students came from local communities throughout the empire, but also from distant regions, including North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually sub-Saharan Africa beyond the empire's borders. This international character created an intellectual environment that fostered innovation through the cross-fertilization of different scholarly traditions and cultural perspectives. Faculty members included both local scholars trained in the city's educational institutions and visiting intellectuals who brought expertise from other centers of learning. The informal structure of the university allowed for flexible arrangements where prominent scholars could establish their own schools and curricula, while participating in the broader intellectual community. This diversity of approaches and perspectives created a vibrant academic environment that encouraged original thinking and scholarly debate. The curriculum that evolved at Sankora reflected both Islamic educational traditions and local innovations adapted to African conditions and interests. Religious studies formed the core of the educational program, but students also studied grammar, rhetoric, logic, mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. Advanced students could pursue specialized training in law, theology, or other fields that prepared them for careers in government, commerce, or religious leadership. The teaching methods employed combined lecture-based instruction with small group discussions and individual mentoring relationships between faculty and students. The emphasis on memorization that characterized Islamic education was balanced with analytical approaches that encouraged critical thinking and original research. Students were expected to master existing knowledge while also contributing new insights and interpretations. Jannah, the ancient commercial center that had been peacefully integrated into the empire decades earlier, experienced its own remarkable renaissance during this period. The city's strategic location in the inland delta of the Niger River made it a natural hub for trade between different ecological zones, but deliberate investment in infrastructure and institutions transformed it into much more than just a commercial center. The architectural achievements in Jannah represented another distinctive synthesis of local traditions with international influences. The Great Mosque, rebuilt during this period, became a masterpiece of Sudano-Sahelian architecture, featuring the characteristic mud brick construction techniques that had been refined over centuries of local innovation. The building's massive walls, supported by an intricate framework of wooden beams, could withstand both the intense heat of the dry season and the torrential rains of the wet season. The mosque's distinctive appearance, with its towering spires and protruding wooden supports that created dramatic patterns of light and shadow, became an iconic symbol of West African Islamic architecture. But the building was also functionally sophisticated, with interior spaces designed for large congregations while maintaining acoustic properties that allowed speakers to be heard throughout the structure. The commercial infrastructure that developed in Jannah reflected centuries of experience in facilitating trade between different cultural and economic systems. Markets were organized by product type and origin, with separate areas for local agricultural products, regional craft goods, and international luxury items.
Standardized weights and measures reduced transaction costs and prevented disputes, while commercial law courts provided mechanisms for resolving conflicts that inevitably arose in complex business relationships. The city's textile industry became particularly renowned throughout West Africa and beyond. Local cotton production was supplemented with imported materials to create fabrics that combined traditional patterns with techniques learned through international contact. The distinctive indigo-dyed cloth produced in Jannah workshops became a prestige item throughout the region, while exported textiles carried the city's reputation to distant markets. Nani, the political capital,
located in the empire's heartland, developed differently from the commercial centers but was no less impressive in its achievements. As the seat of government, the city housed the administrative apparatus that managed one of the world's largest political entities. The palace complex alone covered several square miles and included not just residential quarters for the royal family, but also offices for the bureaucracy, audience halls for conducting official business, and ceremonial spaces for state occasions. The political architecture of Nani reflected the empire's commitment to inclusive governance while also projecting imperial power and authority. The Great Audience Hall, where the emperor held court, was designed to accommodate representatives from throughout the territories, with seating arrangements that honored different cultural traditions while maintaining imperial protocol. Separate reception areas allowed for private meetings with governors, foreign diplomats, and other officials who required confidential consultations. The administrative quarter of the city housed the growing bureaucracy that managed imperial affairs. Government offices were organized by function, with separate departments handling taxation, military affairs, diplomatic relations, legal matters, and commercial regulation. The physical layout of these facilities reflected the empire's administrative sophistication, with efficient workflows that could process the enormous volume of paperwork required to govern such a vast territory. The Royal Library at Nani complemented the scholarly collections at Sunkor, but focused more specifically on governmental and administrative documents. Chronicles of imperial history, legal precedents, diplomatic correspondence, and administrative records were carefully preserved and organized for reference by government officials. This institutional memory provided continuity across changes in leadership, while also supporting effective decision-making based on historical experience. The social structure that characterized these great cities reflected the empire's broader commitment to balancing hierarchy with mobility and opportunity. Traditional caste distinctions continued to influence social organization, but urban environments created new possibilities for advancement and achievement that transcended inherited status. The merchant class that emerged in these cities represented a new form of social organization that combined economic success with cultural sophistication. Successful traders accumulated not just material resources, but also social capital through their networks of business relationships, cultural knowledge gained through travel, and political influence derived from their economic importance. Many merchants invested their profits in education, religious institutions, and cultural patronage that enhanced their social status while contributing to community development. Artisan communities continued to play crucial roles in urban society, but their activities expanded far beyond traditional craft production. Metalworkers, textile producers, leather workers, and other craftspeople developed new techniques and products that served both local needs and international markets. The guild systems that organized these activities provided not just economic coordination, but also social welfare and political representation for their members.
The scholarly class that developed around the educational institutions represented another form of social mobility and achievement. Students from various backgrounds could advance through educational achievement to positions of influence and authority. Successful scholars often became advisors to political leaders, judges in legal proceedings, or teachers who shaped the next generation of educated citizens. Women's roles in these urban societies reflected the empire's broader commitment to gender equity, while also adapting to the specific opportunities and challenges of city life. Female merchants operated extensive business networks that connected local producers with distant markets. Women scholars contributed to intellectual life through their own research and teaching, while also supporting the educational institutions through patronage and administration.
The religious life of these cities embodied the empire's distinctive approach to spiritual diversity and tolerance. Islamic institutions flourished with government support, but traditional African religious practices continued to play important roles in community life. The synthesis that emerged created new forms of religious expression that drew from multiple traditions while maintaining theological coherence and social relevance. Islamic scholarship reached remarkable levels of sophistication, with local scholars making original contributions to theology, law, and other fields that gained recognition throughout the Islamic world. The madrasas associated with major mosques provided formal religious education that prepared students for careers in religious leadership, while also offering basic literacy and numeracy training that served broader educational needs. Traditional religious practices adapted to urban environments while maintaining their essential spiritual functions. Seasonal festivals continued to mark important agricultural cycles and community milestones. Ancestor veneration remained central to family and clan identity. Sacred sites within and around the cities received protection and maintenance that preserved their ritual significance. The syncretic practices that emerged from this religious diversity created distinctive forms of spiritual expression that became characteristic of imperial culture. Architectural elements from different traditions were combined in religious buildings. Ritual practices incorporated elements from multiple spiritual systems. Religious authorities from different traditions often collaborated in community ceremonies and conflict resolution. Daily life in these great cities reflected unprecedented levels of prosperity and cultural sophistication for ordinary citizens. Markets offered goods from throughout the known world, creating consumer choices that had previously been available only to ruling elites. Educational opportunities provided pathways for personal advancement and intellectual development. Cultural institutions offered entertainment and enrichment that enhanced quality of life. Housing standards improved dramatically as construction techniques advanced and economic prosperity increased. Multi-story buildings became common in commercial districts, while residential areas featured houses built around courtyards that provided privacy and comfort for extended families. Sanitation systems were developed that maintained public health even as population density increased. Dietary diversity expanded as trade networks brought new foods and cooking techniques to urban markets. Local agricultural products were supplemented with imported spices, dried fruits, and other luxury foods that had previously been available only to wealthy elites. Cooking traditions evolved to incorporate these new ingredients while maintaining distinctive local flavors and preparation methods. Clothing and personal adornment reflected both increased prosperity and cultural exchange. Local textile traditions were enhanced with imported materials and techniques. Jewelry and decorative arts incorporated designs and materials from throughout the commercial networks. Fashion became a form of cultural expression that reflected both individual taste and social status. The intellectual life of these cities represented one of the most remarkable achievements of medieval African civilization. The combination of extensive libraries, diverse scholarly communities, and supportive institutional frameworks created environments where knowledge flourished and original thinking was encouraged and rewarded. Scientific investigation advanced through the systematic study of mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and natural philosophy. Local scholars made observations and calculations that contributed to the broader development of Islamic science, while also addressing practical problems relevant to African conditions. Medical knowledge was particularly important given the health challenges posed by urban populations and long-distance travel. Literary production flourished as poets, chroniclers, and other writers found patronage and audiences for their work. Historical writing preserved the empire's remarkable story, while also contributing to broader understanding of African societies and achievements. Poetry and fiction explored themes of love, heroism, and spiritual development that resonated with diverse audiences. Legal scholarship addressed the complex challenges of governing diverse populations under unified legal systems.
Scholars worked to reconcile different legal traditions while developing new approaches to commercial law, criminal justice, and family relations. The legal innovations that emerged influenced jurisprudence throughout West Africa and beyond. By 1400, these great cities had established themselves among the most sophisticated urban centers in the medieval world. Their achievements in architecture, education, commerce, and culture rivaled those of contemporary cities in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The intellectual and cultural innovations that emerged from these urban environments would influence African development for centuries, while also contributing to the broader advance of human knowledge and achievement. The transformation of the empire from a military confederation into a sophisticated urban civilization represented one of the most remarkable achievements in medieval history. The cities that emerged during this golden age demonstrated that African societies could create and sustain complex institutions that supported both material prosperity and cultural achievement on a scale that commanded international respect and admiration. The death of the great emperor in 1337 marked the end of an era that had seen the transformation of a regional kingdom into a global power. His passing left behind an inheritance that was both magnificent and precarious. vast territories unified under sophisticated institutions, but also an enormous political structure that required exceptional leadership to maintain cohesion across such diverse populations and distances. The succession crisis that followed revealed the first serious weakness in the governmental systems that had served so effectively during the previous century. Unlike the smooth transitions that had characterized earlier periods, the transfer of power after 1337 sparked disputes that would weaken central authority for decades. Multiple claimants emerged from the royal family, each supported by different factions within the political elite and different regional power bases throughout the territories. The traditional succession principles established by the founder had worked well when the royal family was relatively small and the political elite remained unified around shared goals and values. But generations of expansion and prosperity had created a much larger royal family with multiple branches that could claim legitimate rights to rule. The wealth generated by the pilgrimage and subsequent commercial success had also created new centers of power and influence that complicated the traditional consensus-building processes. Regional governors who had grown accustomed to considerable autonomy during the height of expansion began asserting even greater independence as central authority wavered. Some provincial leaders declared their support for particular claimants to the throne, but used this allegiance as justification for policies that served regional rather than imperial interests. Others remained nominally loyal while effectively governing their territories as independent kingdoms. The consequences of this political fragmentation became apparent almost immediately. Tax collection became irregular as provincial administrators prioritized local needs over imperial obligations. Military recruitment suffered as regional leaders retained forces for their own purposes rather than contributing to imperial defense. Commercial regulation broke down as different provinces implemented contradictory policies that disrupted trade networks and created new sources of conflict. The succession disputes also exposed deeper tensions within the political system that had been masked by the remarkable success of previous decades. The inclusive governance that had been a source of strength during expansion became a source of weakness when consensus broke down. Traditional elites who had accepted imperial rule while maintaining local authority began questioning whether continued participation in the imperial system served their interests. Religious tensions that had been successfully managed through policies of tolerance and accommodation began surfacing as different factions sought to gain advantage through appeals to particular communities. Some claimants emphasized their Islamic credentials to gain support from scholarly and merchant communities, while others appealed to traditional beliefs to strengthen their position among rural populations. The economic problems that emerged during this period of political instability were compounded by external pressures that challenged the commercial foundations of imperial power. The most serious threat came from the expanding Songhai kingdom, centered around Gao, which had grown increasingly powerful and ambitious under the leadership of the Sunni dynasty.
Songhai's challenge to imperial dominance was both economic and political. The kingdom controlled strategic positions along the Niger River that allowed it to disrupt the trade routes that had been crucial to imperial prosperity. Shanghai merchants began offering alternative commercial networks that bypassed imperial territories, while Songhai military forces threatened imperial control over key commercial centers. The cultural and political appeal of Songhai's challenge went beyond simple economic competition. The kingdom represented a different model of African governance that emphasized military prowess and cultural unity over the inclusive diversity that had characterized imperial rule. Some populations that had become restive under imperial authority found this alternative attractive, particularly groups that felt their interests had been subordinated to broader imperial goals. The loss of Timbuktu to Songhai forces around 1433 represented more than just military defeat. It symbolized the breakdown of the imperial system that had created one of medieval Africa's greatest centers of learning and commerce. The fall of such an important city demonstrated that the imperial government could no longer protect its most valuable assets, encouraging other regions to seek accommodation with rising powers rather than remaining loyal to a weakening center. The Tuareg incursions that intensified during this period represented another external challenge that exploited imperial weakness while creating new sources of instability. These nomadic peoples had traditionally maintained complex relationships with sedentary societies, sometimes serving as trading partners and sometimes as raiders, depending on political and environmental conditions. The breakdown of imperial authority created opportunities for Tuareg groups to expand their influence through both military action and political alliance building.
Some Tuareg leaders formed partnerships with rebellious provincial governors, providing military support in exchange for commercial privileges and territorial concessions. Others operated independently, raiding trade routes and settlements while avoiding direct confrontation with imperial forces. The mobility and fighting skills of Tuareg warriors made them particularly difficult enemies for imperial forces that had been designed primarily for conventional warfare and territorial defense. The nomadic lifestyle of these groups meant they could strike quickly and then withdraw to areas where imperial forces could not easily follow. Their knowledge of desert routes and conditions gave them advantages that conventional military forces could not match. The economic disruption caused by these incursions extended far beyond the immediate areas where fighting occurred. Trade routes that had operated safely for generations became dangerous, forcing merchants to seek alternative paths or abandon long-distance commerce altogether. The increased costs and risks of commercial activity reduced the tax revenues that had supported imperial administration, while also undermining the prosperity that had legitimized imperial rule. Internal rebellions became increasingly common as central authority weakened and external threats mounted. Provincial governors who had initially supported particular succession claimants began acting as independent rulers. When it became clear that the imperial government could not provide effective leadership or protection, some rebellions were led by traditional religious authorities to legitimize their opposition to imperial rule, arguing that the government had abandoned the spiritual principles that had originally justified its authority.
Islamic scholarly communities found themselves in particularly difficult positions as different factions claimed to represent authentic Islamic governance while pursuing policies that served narrow political interests. The breakdown of the patronage systems that had supported scholarly institutions created economic pressures that forced many intellectuals to seek new sources of support, often requiring them to take sides in political conflicts. Environmental pressures that had always challenged imperial administration became more severe as political instability reduced the government's capacity to respond effectively to natural disasters and climate variations. The Sahel region experienced a series of severe droughts during the 14th and 15th centuries that disrupted agricultural production and forced large-scale population movements. The imperial government had previously managed such environmental challenges through coordinated responses that moved resources from surplus areas to regions experiencing shortages. But the breakdown of central authority meant that provincial administrators prioritized local needs over broader imperial coordination, reducing the effectiveness of disaster response and increasing the severity of environmental impacts. Climate stress interacted with political instability to create cascading problems that overwhelmed the imperial system's capacity for adaptation. Populations fleeing from drought-stricken areas created pressures on resources in regions that were already struggling with political and economic disruption. Competition for scarce resources generated conflicts between different communities that further undermined political stability. The disruption of agricultural production had particularly severe effects on urban populations that depended on rural surpluses for food security. Cities that had grown large during the period of imperial prosperity found it increasingly difficult to maintain their populations as food supplies became unreliable and expensive. Some urban centers experienced significant population decline as residents migrated to rural areas where they could engage in subsistence farming. Trade networks that had been carefully developed over generations began fragmenting as political instability and environmental pressures made long-distance commerce increasingly risky and unprofitable. Merchants who had invested heavily in commercial relationships and infrastructure found their assets becoming worthless as routes became unsafe and markets became unreliable. The breakdown of commercial networks had multiplier effects throughout the imperial economy. Craft producers who had specialized in goods for long-distance trade found their skills and products no longer in demand. Communities that had developed around commercial activities experienced economic decline that forced residents to seek alternative livelihoods. The tax revenues that had supported imperial administration declined as commercial activity decreased. Currency systems that had facilitated trade across vast distances became less useful as political fragmentation reduced the areas where particular forms of money were accepted. The imperial government's ability to maintain stable monetary policy was undermined by its reduced control over tax collection and commercial regulation. Some regions began developing their own currency systems, further fragmenting the economic integration that had been a source of strength. The military forces that had been instrumental in creating and maintaining the imperial system proved inadequate for dealing with the new challenges that emerged during this period of decline. The imperial army had been designed primarily for conventional warfare and territorial conquest, but the threats now facing the government required different capabilities. Dealing with nomadic raiders required mobility and desert warfare skills that conventional imperial forces lacked.
Suppressing rebellions in diverse provinces required local knowledge and cultural sensitivity that centralized military organizations could not easily provide. Protecting trade routes required maintaining security across vast areas with limited resources and uncertain political support. The recruitment systems that had provided reliable military manpower during periods of expansion became problematic when central authority weakened. Provincial governors who controlled recruitment began retaining forces for their own purposes rather than contributing to imperial defense. The loyalty of military units became questionable when soldiers faced conflicts between imperial orders and local interests. The financial resources necessary to maintain effective military forces became increasingly scarce.
As tax revenues declined and competing priorities multiplied, the imperial government faced difficult choices between funding military campaigns to suppress rebellions, investing in infrastructure to maintain economic activity, and supporting the diplomatic initiatives necessary to preserve political relationships. Administrative systems that had been marvels of organization and efficiency during the height of imperial power began breaking down as the political and economic foundations that supported them eroded. The bureaucracy that had managed affairs across vast territories required stable funding, clear lines of authority, and reliable communication systems, all of which became problematic as central authority weakened. Provincial administrators found themselves caught between imperial directives that might not serve local interests and local pressures that conflicted with imperial policies. Some officials chose loyalty to the imperial government, even when this choice created problems in their provinces, while others prioritized local concerns, even when this meant defying imperial authority. The legal systems that had provided consistent governance across diverse populations became less effective as political fragmentation created competing sources of authority. Provincial courts began applying different interpretations of imperial law, while some regions reverted to traditional legal systems that had been superseded during the period of imperial expansion. Communication networks that had enabled coordination across continental distances became less reliable as political instability and military threats made travel dangerous. The flow of information that had supported effective decision-making was disrupted, creating conditions where imperial authorities made decisions based on incomplete or outdated information about conditions in their territories. By 1450, the imperial system that had once controlled much of West Africa had fragmented into a collection of competing regional powers that maintained only nominal connections to central authority. The great cities that had been centers of learning and commerce experienced decline as the political and economic networks that had supported their prosperity disappeared. The transformation from unified imperial system to fragmented regional powers represented more than just political change. It marked the end of an era of African political organization that had reached levels of sophistication that commanded respect throughout the medieval world. What had once been the mightiest power in West Africa faced its final death blow not from internal decay alone, but from the determined expansion of Songhai under one of the most formidable rulers in African history, Ali Burr. Ascending to leadership of the Songhai Kingdom in 1464, possessed both military genius and political vision necessary to complete the destruction of the fragmenting imperial system. Unlike previous challengers who had nibbled at the edges of imperial territory, this new threat launched a systematic campaign to capture core cities that remained the symbolic and economic heart of the weakened realm. His strategic approach demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how political power operated in the region. Controlling major urban centers would provide both resources necessary for further expansion and legitimacy required to claim succession to imperial authority. Timbuktu fell to siege and capture in 1468, marking the beginning of the end for any hope of imperial revival. While the city had already changed hands multiple times during previous decades of instability, this conquest was different in both scale and finality. Rather than simply occupying the city and extracting tribute, Sunni Ali implemented systematic changes designed to integrate Timbuktu permanently into his expanding kingdom. Scholarly communities that had made the city famous reeled from this devastating blow. Many prominent intellectuals fled to other centers, taking with them manuscripts and knowledge that represented centuries of accumulation.
Educational institutions that had attracted students from across the Islamic world crumbled, ending Timbuktu's role as a major center of scholarship and cultural exchange. Sunni Ali was not content merely to destroy. He also sought to rebuild according to his own vision of regional governments. Administrative systems implemented in conquered territories reflected lessons learned from both successes and failures of imperial rule. Local autonomy was reduced in favor of more direct control, while military organization was restructured to prevent the kind of regional independence that had contributed to imperial fragmentation. Jenne succumbed in 1473 after a prolonged siege that demonstrated both Shanghai military effectiveness and the weakness of remaining imperial forces. Ancient commercial centers that had once been peacefully integrated into the imperial system could no longer rely on imperial protection, and their own defenses proved inadequate against determined assault. Losing Jenne was particularly significant because it represented the loss of one of the most important commercial centers in the region. Its textile industry, craft production, and role as a trade hub had generated revenues that supported imperial administration for over 2 centuries. Capturing the city gave Shanghai control over economic resources that could fund further expansion, while depriving imperial loyalists of crucial sources of support. Military campaigns that brought down these great cities revealed how warfare had evolved in the region during the period of imperial decline. Shanghai forces combined traditional African military techniques with innovations borrowed from North African and Middle Eastern sources. Cavalry units provided mobility and shock power, while infantry forces employed siege techniques that could overcome urban fortifications. Perhaps most importantly, Sunni Ali understood psychological dimensions of conquest in ways that previous challenges had not. His campaigns were designed not just to capture territory, but to demonstrate that the imperial system could no longer protect its supporters.
Each successful siege encouraged other regions to submit voluntarily rather than face similar destruction. River fleets that Sunni Ali developed became crucial elements in Songhai military success. These vessels allowed rapid movement of troops and supplies along the Niger River, while also providing platforms for attacking cities from unexpected directions. Naval capability gave Shanghai strategic advantages that previous powers in the region had not possessed. Final imperial rulers who attempted to resist Songhai expansion found themselves fighting a losing battle against forces that were better organized, more motivated, and commanded superior resources. Last emperors controlled only fragments of territory that had once been unified under central authority, and their attempts to coordinate resistance were hampered by the same regional divisions that had facilitated Shanghai's success. Gao fell around 1475, eliminating the last major imperial stronghold in the eastern territories. Cities that had been among the first major conquests during the period of imperial expansion became among the last to fall during final collapse. Its loss marked the effective end of imperial control over trade routes that had been the foundation of political and economic power. Around 1500, the last effective imperial ruler died, marking the formal end of a political system that had governed much of West Africa for over 2 centuries. Final emperors had been reduced to controlling small territories around the original heartland, unable to project power beyond their immediate vicinity or command loyalty of distant provinces. The political death of the imperial system did not mean the disappearance of its cultural and intellectual achievements. Institutions and traditions that had flourished during the height of imperial power continued to influence African societies long after the government that had created them ceased to exist. Mandicultural identity that had provided the foundation for imperial unity survived the collapse of central political authority. Languages, customs, and social institutions of the Mande peoples continued to spread throughout West Africa, carried by merchants, scholars, and migrants who maintained connections to their cultural homeland even when political unity no longer existed. Gao traditions that had preserved history and values of the imperial period became even more important as political institutions disappeared. These professional historians and musicians served as living repositories of cultural memory, maintaining awareness of past achievements while also adapting traditional stories to changing circumstances. Oral traditions surrounding the founder became particularly significant as symbols of African achievement and potential.
Epic stories bearing his name continued to be performed throughout the region, inspiring future generations with examples of leadership, courage, and political innovation. Values embodied in the founding charter remained influential guides for political and social organization. Islamic scholarly traditions that had flourished in imperial cities continued to influence intellectual development throughout West Africa. Scholars who had been trained in Timbuktu, Jenne, and other centers carried their knowledge to new locations, establishing schools and libraries that maintained connections to the broader Islamic world while serving local educational needs. Manuscript traditions that had made imperial cities famous as centers of learning survived political collapse through preservation efforts by scholarly families
and religious institutions. Thousands of manuscripts were hidden or transported to safety, maintaining collections that would eventually be rediscovered by modern scholars and provide evidence of remarkable intellectual achievements. Architectural styles that had emerged during the imperial period continued to influence building traditions throughout the region. Distinctive mosque architecture of Timbuktu and Jenne became models for religious buildings in other areas, while urban planning techniques developed in imperial cities informed the layout of later settlements. Commercial practices and networks that had been developed during the imperial period adapted to new political circumstances, but maintained many of their essential characteristics. Merchant families that had operated throughout imperial territories continued their activities under new political arrangements, preserving trading relationships and business practices that had proven successful over generations.
Legal traditions that had been synthesized during the imperial period continued to influence dispute resolution and social organization throughout the region. Combinations of traditional African law, Islamic jurisprudence, and imperial precedent created legal frameworks that remained relevant even when central political authority disappeared. Agricultural and technological innovations that had supported imperial prosperity were preserved and transmitted by farming communities and craft guilds. Techniques for crop cultivation, metalworking, textile production, and other essential activities continued to develop and spread throughout the region, maintaining economic foundations that had supported political and cultural achievements. Encounters between surviving remnants of imperial culture and European explorers and colonizers would prove crucial for shaping global understanding of African achievements. When Portuguese explorers began reaching the West African coast in the 15th century, they encountered societies that had been shaped by centuries of imperial influence. Accounts written by these early European visitors provide some of the first written descriptions of African societies that had been largely unknown to European audiences. While these accounts were often biased and incomplete, they also contained recognition of African achievements that challenged prevailing European assumptions about the continent and its peoples. Arab chroniclers who had documented the Great Pilgrimage and its aftermath provided additional sources of information about imperial achievements that would eventually reach European audiences. These accounts, combined with European observations, created awareness of African political and cultural accomplishments that influenced later historical scholarship. Archaeological investigations that began in the 20th century provided physical evidence that confirmed and expanded upon written accounts of imperial achievements. Excavations at Timbuktu, Jenne, Nani, and other sites revealed architectural remains, artifacts, and other materials that demonstrated the scope and sophistication of imperial civilization. Rediscovering manuscript collections in private libraries and family archives provided additional evidence of intellectual achievements that had been largely unknown to modern scholars. These discoveries revealed the extent of scholarly activity, sophistication of educational institutions, and connections between African centers of learning and the broader Islamic world. Modern significance of the imperial legacy extends far beyond historical curiosity or academic research. Achievements of this remarkable political system provide evidence of African capabilities and potential that challenge racist assumptions about the continent and its peoples that have influenced global attitudes for centuries.
Examples of inclusive governance that respected cultural diversity while maintaining political unity offer lessons that remain relevant for contemporary African political development. Challenges of balancing local autonomy with central coordination continue to face African states that must govern diverse populations across vast territories with limited resources. Intellectual and cultural achievements of the imperial period demonstrate the importance of education, scholarship, and cultural exchange for African development. Libraries, schools, and scholarly communities that flourished during the height of imperial power provide models for contemporary efforts to promote education and intellectual development throughout the continent. Commercial networks and economic policies that supported imperial prosperity offer insights into strategies for promoting economic development that builds on African strengths while engaging with global markets. Emphasis on adding value to raw materials, developing manufacturing capabilities, and maintaining control over commercial networks remains relevant for contemporary economic planning. Religious tolerance and cultural synthesis that characterized imperial society provide examples of how African societies can maintain their distinctive identities while participating in global cultural and religious communities. Syncretic practices that emerged during the imperial period demonstrate the creative potential of cultural exchange when it occurs on terms of equality and mutual respect. The legacy of this great African achievement continues to influence Pan-African political thought and cultural identity. Visions of African unity and cooperation that were embodied in the imperial system remain inspiration for contemporary efforts to promote continental integration and cooperation. The historical memory of imperial achievements serves as a source of pride and confidence for African peoples who have faced centuries of exploitation and denigration by external forces. Knowledge that African societies created and sustained one of the medieval world's most sophisticated political systems provides evidence of capabilities and potential that remain relevant for contemporary development efforts. Preserving and studying imperial history has become an important element in efforts to decolonize African education and scholarship by recovering and highlighting African achievements. Contemporary scholars and educators seek to provide more balanced and accurate understanding of the continent's history and potential. Cultural traditions that emerged during the imperial period continue to influence artistic, musical, and literary production throughout West Africa and the African diaspora. Stories, songs, and artistic styles that flourished under imperial patronage remain sources of inspiration for contemporary cultural creators. Political principles embodied in the founding charter continue to influence discussions about governance, human rights, and social organization throughout Africa and beyond. Emphasis on consensus building, environmental protection, and social justice that characterized imperial governance provide examples of indigenous African approaches to political organization that remain relevant for contemporary challenges. Stories of this remarkable African achievement thus serve multiple purposes in contemporary contexts. They provide historical evidence that challenges racist assumptions about African capabilities. They offer practical lessons about governance, economic development, and cultural preservation that remain relevant for contemporary challenges. They serve as sources of pride and inspiration for African peoples who continue to struggle for full recognition of their dignity and potential. Most importantly, the legacies of this great African political achievement demonstrate that the continent has produced sophisticated civilizations that contributed significantly to human development, and that Africa's current challenges do not reflect inherent limitations, but rather consequences of external exploitation and internal conflicts that can be overcome through appropriate policies and international cooperation. Memory of what was once achieved continues to inspire hope for what might be achieved again under more favorable circumstances, making stories of this remarkable African success not just chapters in ancient history, but living inspiration for contemporary efforts to realize Africa's full potential in the modern world.